Hi, welcome back to Session 3 of World Civilizations, History 3380. This is Part 2 of Session 3, as is listed on your syllabus. Now, last time I was talking about social organizations in the pre-modern world, and we looked at two in particular, kinship or lineage, whereby people are organized, are connected in extended family groups. And we looked at several examples of this, tribal groups in the Middle East, etc. And we also looked at clientage or patron-client relations, where there is a dominant figure, a patron, who has essentially a contractual relationship with subordinate people who owe him certain responsibilities, certain services, and he in turn usually offers his protection or some other type of service to them. Feudalism in Europe with lords and vassals, typical example of this kind of system. Now, in describing the way people organize themselves, I mentioned at the beginning of that if you wanted to talk about people in terms of their function in society, then most people would fall into the category of being peasants, especially to a lesser degree herders, and then merchants and artisans. Merchants and artisans were a tiny percentage of the world's population back in the pre-modern world. 90% of the world's population by the beginning of the contemporary era, let's say 2,000 years ago, at least 90% would have been peasants, working the land, growing crops. And this really provided the underpinning for societies, civilizations around the globe, because agriculture provided a steady base of resources on which to build state systems, on which to build civilizations. Year after year, agricultural products could be produced and they could be taxed, and the labor of peasants could be secured for building empires, whether it's the Roman Empire or an early Chinese empire, such as the Song, etc. Agriculture was the core of economic activity in the pre-modern world. The other option for economic activity was trade, and that's the one we're going to talk about today, because it's with the growing set of trade connections in the world that we begin to enter the early modern age, where people start to make long-distance economic connections with each other, and this helps spur, along with several other developments, the coming of the modern age over the last 500 years. And in the first slide here, I'm talking about trade as the critical link, and it is this critical link between the pre-modern and the modern world, because it does help accelerate economic activity. Now, trade, for the most part, in the pre-modern world was extremely local and regional. In other words, people traded goods between villages, between a group of villages in a particular province, let us say, but it was extremely limited for the most part. There were exceptions, what were known as the Silk Roads, the trade links that ran from China all the way to the Eastern Mediterranean. But the Silk Road was exceptional. It was involved in the exchange of precious goods, particularly silks coming from Asia, and then silver coming out of, let us say, the Roman Empire in the Eastern Mediterranean, exchanges of highly precious goods. And it was a very tiny percentage of the total economy of any society that was involved in this type of trade. And the reasons were, again, that generally transportation was wretched. There were few well-developed roads in the pre-modern world. There were some, but they mostly were limited for the purposes of imperial control and not primarily trade. In addition, there was high risk in any type of long-distance overland trade because of bandits. So relatively little trade went on over long distances, and exceptions were there, like the Silk Roads, but they were the exception. Now, ocean travel was the other possibility. It's cheaper, generally faster, but it too had its limitations. First of all, in the pre-modern world, if we go back a couple of thousand years, ships were not terribly seaworthy. They weren't capable of sailing long distances. Secondly, weather was a problem. Weather forecasting had not developed up until that time, and to be caught out in the ocean when any type of storm occurred, if you've ever been out sailing or boating, and even a minor rainstorm comes along, you realize just how rough the water can get. So there are those constant dangers. And then winter, in those temperate climates where winter occurs, made it virtually impossible to sail. In addition to that, on the seas where trade did develop, there was the additional risk, as there was on land, of banditry, in this case, pirates. So these kinds of limitations in the pre-modern world made it extremely difficult to develop long-distance trade routes. The advantage of trade, on the other hand, is that it is enormously profitable. It can generate huge increases in people's incomes and in the revenues of states that control trading networks. Trade in the pre-modern and in the early modern world is extremely risky. Quite possible you could lose everything. Send out 2 or 3 vessels on a trading venture, they get lost in a storm, that's it. You suddenly find yourself as the merchant of Venice. Lost your fortune. Even when that didn't happen, there were the dangers that you send your ships out to secure a precious good like silks because prices are very high in the market, and by the time your ships get back loaded with silk, other vessels have arrived with the same commodity, the price has plummeted, and suddenly you're losing money, not making it. Given these risks, trade was a high-profit venture. For those who could do it successfully, huge amounts of money could be generated. So, inevitably, there were increasing efforts over the centuries, particularly as we begin the contemporary era, by certain societies to establish long-term effective trade linkages, because it meant the ability to vastly increase resources, income for the state and for the society as a whole. Now, we're also going to see, of course, that building your empire on trade can also have significant risks. But the potential was there for vast and rapid expansion. The time is quickly coming as we enter the contemporary era, as we enter, well, let's say the early modern world, say about 1200 contemporary era. As we get up to that period, increasing interregional long-distance trade is going to create new opportunities for vast expansion of state systems because of the resources that trade will generate. Now, one thing we have to keep in mind that I mentioned last time, because it's going to be an ongoing theme, and that is that trade involves not only exchanges of commodities, the basic exchange of goods, but also inevitably exchanges of ideas. We saw how Islam, in part, was able to spread its message through Islamic merchants who spread the ideas over much of North Africa and into the Indian Ocean and beyond. We'll come back a little bit to that later on as well. But inevitably, trade brings with it not just commodities, but ideas. They may be religious ideas, they may be technological ideas, but it brings ideas. And then the third thing that it brings, both in the past and the present, is death. We're going to spend the next session, session 4, talking about death, everyone's favorite topic. Disease, epidemic disease, was an inevitable consequence of long-distance trade, and we'll see how that affects the coming of the modern age as well, but that's for next time. But we need to keep in mind that all 3 of these are linked to trade. The examples we're going to look at are 3. One in Southeast Asia, a trading empire, another in Africa, and finally, the Mongols. People think of the Mongols essentially as, oh, that barbarian horde that swept through China and across Eurasia. But the term barbarian is really a term applied by sedentary people to the Mongols. The fact is, the Mongols, as we will see, created the greatest land-based empire in the history of the world, and along the way they had an enormous impact upon trade, making overland trade over vast distances in large quantities really possible for the first time. And as we'll see next time, they also helped set the stage for the Black Death to kill much of the world's population. But that was an unintended consequence. They weren't really planning on that. First of all, looking at Southeast Asia, there are really 2 trading empires we're going to look at. One is Funan in Southeast Asia. Now, I'll come back to that slide in a second. Here on this slide, when you're looking in this area. This is the part of Southeast Asia where Funan was located. And Funan's function was to serve as a way station for trade coming from China. This is Southeast China up here in this corner. Trade coming from China through Funan and then on into the Indian Ocean and to the Indian subcontinent. These were major trade routes. Funan was essentially right in the center of it, and that's what allowed this kingdom to extend its development from agriculture into long-distance trade. The kingdom of Funan is located, or was located, along Mekong River Delta, the river that runs along the western borders of modern-day Vietnam. And as I said, it was an agricultural empire built on the production of rice, which extended its activities into trade as trade between China and India, trade carried out across the oceans, begins to pick up at the beginning of the contemporary era. This is Funan's central function. It's right at the nexus of these trade routes. Again, long-distance trade wasn't conducted by a single group of merchants who would travel from China all the way to India, exchange goods, and then sail back. That just really wasn't feasible. It occurred in a series of exchanges. Chinese merchants might come as far as Funan, exchange their goods there for goods coming from India, and then other merchants would take the goods from there to India. So Funan's advantage is it's this trading outpost, this point where these exchanges can occur on very long-distance routes, these being the routes between China and India. By the 5th century of the contemporary era, Funan had gone into decline. It went into decline because an alternative route for trade between China and India had developed that was faster and more efficient. And basically Funan was out of luck. That route went through the Strait of Malacca. And I'll show you this on the map in a moment, how this worked. But Funan's advantage of being this nexus point for trade between India and China was rapidly disappearing by the 5th century as seamen and merchants found an alternative route and largely bypassed Funan in the future. If we go back to the map here, now, let's see, if we look at China again up here in the right-hand corner and then come down and see Funan here, it seems logical that, okay, you come from China down to Funan and then over to India, but in fact what you had to do is come down this way or go overland for part of the route to get to India. What began to develop by the 5th century was trade routes that came straight down to the Strait of Malacca, which is here, this spot between modern-day Malaya and Indonesia. Right in this strait here, they would come straight down, sail through the Strait of Malacca, and then on into India. And again, this wasn't the same ships and the same people doing the entire route, but rather this was the overall route that would be taken by people who might come as far as the straits, exchange their goods, and then move on up. Another group of merchants would take the goods further on into India. So this route was actually faster because it was more direct than hugging the coast and going to Funan. Why did it develop? Part because of increased knowledge of ocean currents, in part because of improved sailing vessels that didn't have to hug the coastline anymore, that could actually sail out into the ocean. That set of circumstances helped lead to the rise of the second Southeast Asian trading empire, Srivijaya. Srivijaya was an island empire that developed in the contemporary era. It based its development on trade virtually from the beginning. Malay seamen were a lineage group, in other words, a kin group, who engaged in trade and warfare on the seas as a customary practice. In other words, they're a little bit like a caste group in India in the sense that this is both a kin group and people who have a common specialized economic function. They're sailors. They're sea warriors at the same time. So it was not surprising that this new empire was able to create an economy based largely on economic exchange, because the people who comprised it were already engaged in that kind of activity as their principal form of economic development. So it was simply a matter of a dominant kin group emerging and creating an imperial system that could control these routes. Srivijaya is one of the distinctive empires of the early contemporary era because it is almost exclusively a trading empire. In other words, if you look at other empires in the world, even Funan starts out with an agricultural base and continues to maintain an agricultural base even though it becomes heavily involved in trade. Other empires in the world at this time were still overwhelmingly agricultural in their economic focus. Yes, they all had some degree of trade involved in their economy, but none of them relied to any great extent on long-distance trade as a key economic function. It was a supplement, an addition, but not the key one. Here, in this Buddhist empire, along the Straits of Malaya, we see one of the first examples in the contemporary era of an empire that's based almost exclusively on trade. Going back to the map for a second, down here you can see Palembang, which is the capital, and the extent of the empire is basically where I'm showing you in this area on lands bordering on either side of the Strait of Malaya, and again, lands that would now comprise, in part, modern-day Malaya and modern-day Indonesia. And this is where the empire extended to. Now, the imperial system was created both by trade, but also by warfare. The simple fact was that at the beginning of the contemporary era and right down through modern times, trade and warfare have been inextricably linked. That you don't develop a trading empire simply by going out and sending ships out to exchange goods. There are always other political forces that control other ports, control parts of trading links, and you have to go out and defeat those people in order to expand your own economic system. So this is not just a peaceful imperial venture where you go out and create economic links. It's one where military force, naval and land forces are used to expand the power of the empire. Now, as we were talking about earlier in the course, spiritual beliefs, religion, remain a critical part of virtually every state system. And so too in this Buddhist empire. The emperor believed that the wealth of his dynasty depended upon the favorable inclinations of the sea gods. And so the emperor each morning would cast gold bars into the harbor that lay along the capital, essentially making an offering to the sea gods who had brought such wealth to his empire. So still, this is a highly practical, economically driven empire, but still religious beliefs envelop it as well. A belief that the wealth of the empire is directly linked to the positive attitudes of the gods. Now, one of the things that is critical in creating successful trading empires over time is standardization. And again, in many ways, Srivijaya offers an early example of how modern empires were going to function. in its processes of standardization. Something as simple as establishing a supervisor of weights and measures. Sounds very mundane. That these are the standard weights to be used when weighing cargoes. These are the measures we use. In other words, how long is this piece of wood that you're shipping? How heavy is this object? Establishing that and maintaining those standards is central to any economic empire. This provides, again, the basis for what's going to be done by other empires in a much more modern age. Today, one of the things that's allowed globalization to be possible is a standardization of things like measures. You know, the metric system is dominant. I know we don't use it. We mostly don't use it. But the fact is it's come to dominate the world standard. You standardize rights of people in terms of their access to technology. That allows economic expansion. So too, this Buddhist empire, more than 1,000 years ago, was engaged in similar kinds of activities because it made trade much easier, facilitated trade, if people everywhere within the system were functioning with the same standards by which they would weigh things, measure things, and therefore sell things to one another. Now, over time, the empire faced challenges from Burma and Thailand. In other words, from states along the Southeast Asian peninsula. States that wanted to intervene in the trade that the empire controlled through the Straits of Malacca and towards India. These challenges, while serious, were not the most critical problems for the empire. They resulted in warfare and attacks on opposing ports, etc., but they were sort of part of the rules of the game, if you will. The great challenge that finally undermined this Buddhist trading empire was the coming of Muslim merchants. This is what eventually led to the decline of the empire. I talked about how trade helps spread ideas, spread religion. Well, religion can also facilitate, or culture, can facilitate the development of trade networks. Remember, this is trade that's being carried out over incredibly long distances, where it may take months, if not several years, to complete a trading voyage. Your ability to control the people involved in this system, and I say you, I mean a merchant engaged in this process, your ability to control the actors is extremely limited. You're, let us say, a Chinese merchant, you're operating in an empire in the Malaccan Straits. In turn, people there are operating through merchants in India and perhaps a dozen other places. Languages are different, cultures are different, values are different, laws are different. But if you did share a common culture, particularly one like Islam, that incorporates not only religious beliefs, but laws that specify what proper commercial conduct is, laws that govern commercial transactions, then that would enormously facilitate your activities. And this was precisely the advantage that Muslim merchants had in the period after the emergence of Islam, after the 7th century, is that they did share a common culture, they did share common values, they did recognize common legal standards. And as a result, this greatly facilitated the development of Muslim trading networks over much of the globe, from Northwest Africa all the way to the Straits of Malacca. And we're going to look at this in a second. So what undermines the Buddhist empire is competition with the Muslim merchants who have a standard set of laws, of codes of conduct, and a common set of cultural values that allows them to function with great facility among themselves and soon displaces this trading empire on the Malaccan Straits. The fate of this empire also points to the problem that trading empires were always fragile, always danger, because unlike agriculture, which steadily produced crops every year, which tax readily, might not grow very fast in terms of income, but it was steady, trade, there were all kinds of challenges, threats from other trading groups, problems potentially, for example, what happens to Funan when another trade route is found? They disappear. What about competition from a more coherent cultural force like Islam? Again, you're in trouble. It also relies on the cooperation of a series of complex networks, relationships with Chinese merchants, relationships with Hindu merchants in India, relationships with Burmese merchants in Southeast Asia, and with their state systems. Maintaining all of this in a relatively stable balance was a challenge that usually defied most state systems past perhaps a century or two. Most trading empires found it difficult to maintain their power very long. Now, here's another map. And this shows the world from Northwest Africa all the way to China. And you'll see that there's a line running around the outside of the map. That is not a trade route. Okay, oops, back we go. That is actually showing the region encompassed by Islamic trade relationships. This entire part of the world shows both the extent of Islam's influence. This is a little bit later than when we're talking about. This comes up to the 12th century, the 13th and 14th centuries. But still, you see the vast area that's encompassed by Islamic trade routes and by Islamic merchants, demonstrating just how powerful and influential trade groups could be when they shared common culture, common legal system. Now, what we're looking at in particular here is this part of Africa, to look at the next example of a trading empire, the trading empire of Mali. Okay? We'll get to that specifically in a moment. What's important is here in Mali, there were connections with trade into the Middle East and all the way to Asia. And here in northern Africa, the Sahara Desert functioned in its own way like an ocean that the people of Mali used to extend their trading influence over across Africa and all the way into Asia. Now, the people of the Mali Empire, the dominant group, were the Mande. That's a linguistic distinction in terms of that was the common language. The Mande people of West Africa had developed their culture on the grasslands of Western Africa. And they effectively lived on the edge of the Sahara Desert. That desert, in time, came to be like an ocean, with extended trade routes stretched across the Sahara Desert into Egypt, into the Arabian Peninsula, and then with subsequent linkages on into India and China. One of the critical developments for this desert to become, in effect, like an ocean was the introduction of camels into Western Africa, about 200 of the contemporary era. Okay, so about a little over 1,800 years ago. Camels made an enormous difference. These were the dromedary camels, the ones you most commonly see in films. You know, if you see the films of the Egyptian pyramids and so forth, and people getting camel rides, that's what they're riding, is dromedary camels. The camels, of course, had an incredible ability to travel enormous distances through the heat, retaining large amounts of water, relying only on minimal amounts of water to make their long voyages, and they could carry considerable amounts of weight of goods across this vast desert. So the camels essentially became the ships of the desert, as they're often referred to. Their introduction made it possible to transport significant amounts of goods. But again, remember, we're talking about precious goods. We're talking about gold, silver, silks, spices. So we're not talking, you know, trailer trucks full of goods, but we are talking, precious goods. And certainly camels were capable of carrying hundreds of pounds of these goods across the vast distances of the desert. So Mali, as much as it's a land-based empire, really functions much like the other trading empires that we've just looked at that function directly on the water and use the oceans for the transport of goods. Now, the goods that were primarily traded included gold, copper, ivory, and wood. These were the goods coming from the empire. Have you ever heard of Timbuktu? Timbuktu was a fabled mining center right in the heart of the Mali Empire in Western Africa. And this provided the gold that was such a critical part of exchange for the empire during its development. So here we have these basic goods that can then be traded for other precious goods like silks, like spices, and other products coming from the east. But what we see developing clearly with the development of the Mali Empire is this vast network of trade that links people all the way in China to people all the way in the northwestern reaches of the African continent. Now again, this is still highly selective trade. These are precious goods, these are small amounts. Only a small portion of the entire population is directly involved in that trade itself. But still, when we're thinking that this is some 2,000 years ago, it is striking just how far goods could be traded and just how innovative people were in bringing that process about. Now, Mali reaches its height of power about the 14th century, where it controls much of northwest Africa. That power was due in no small measure to the fact that Mali at that time, in the 1300s, that's what the 14th century is, Mali had become the largest supplier of gold in the world. That's why Timbuktu took on such mythical significance, because of the fabulous wealth that this mining center produced in the heart of the Mali Empire. One of the most remembered emperors of the Mali Empire was Mansa Musa. He was not the greatest by any means of the Mali emperors. He was not really responsible for the tremendous expansion of the Mali Empire and its power. But he is the most remembered because in the 14th century, and remember the Mali Empire is an Islamic society, he takes a pilgrimage, his Hajj, to Mecca. So he travels across North Africa all the way to the Arabian Peninsula, all the way to Mecca. Let's go back and we see here, he would be here in the Mali Empire, he would have traveled all the way across North Africa and down into the Arabian Peninsula to make his pilgrimage, something that was one of the 5 basic pillars of the Islamic faith. Along the way, and he had a caravan, by the way, of thousands of camels and thousands of people traveling with him. He brought enormous amounts of gold, which he distributed liberally to people that he encountered along the way. He spent fabulous amounts of money. Sort of a early version of 14th century celebrity, throwing money around anywhere and making a huge impression. In fact, it was said that even in Mecca, where there were annual pilgrimages by hundreds of thousands of the faithful, and where pilgrims, who of course had to travel long distances, themselves brought substantial amounts of wealth with them to pay for their trip, whether it was in the form of gold, silver, jewels, pearls, etc. Even though Mecca was accustomed to considerable circulation of wealth as a result of these pilgrimages, nothing compared to what this Mali emperor spent in his visit there. In fact, the price of gold was actually driven down in Mecca because of the fact that he gave away so much of his wealth in this trip. That was an indication of just how important, how dynamic the Mali economy had become during its growth and development. The empire really consisted of a network of towns, villages, but more of towns, sort of on the order of small cities, that served as the key trading posts for this complex economy of exchange. Now, As with earlier trading empires that we saw in Southeast Asia, so too this empire wasn't simply created by going out and offering to trade goods with various people. Conquest, warfare, was a part of this process. And in that process, both men and women were taken as slaves. And women in particular found themselves doing much of the labor of the empire. When they were taken and subjugated as slaves, much of the basic economic activity. For example, you still had to have agricultural production. You had to have people cutting down the valuable woods that were used in exchange. People had to do the basic economic work, and much of that work was being done by women who had been enslaved during the expansion of the Mali Empire. So as we've seen elsewhere in the pre-modern world, the world of the early contemporary era, women usually find themselves in subordinated positions in most societies in the era before modernity. This was fairly typical. In this case, slavery, but other forms of subjugation were equally apparent in other societies of the time. Now, one of the keys for the expansion of the Mali Empire in terms of its trade patterns was the simple fact that Mali was sitting on this area of grasslands, and there's also some fairly fertile agricultural lands, and right on the border of this vast desert. One of the keys for the Mali Empire was the fact that it used that distinction to exchange goods coming from different ecological environments. In other words, gold for camels. Exchanging wood produced in the empire itself for valuable goods like camels to people who otherwise would have relatively little access, people from the desert ecology would have relatively little access to wood, even rudimentary forms of wood to use for fires at night when the desert gets cold. There's a logical exchange here, and the Mali Empire is taking advantage of that, of trading one type of good coming from grasslands and farmlands for goods coming from a desert environment. Now, it also built its power, the Mande people, the Mali Empire. They also built their power on the control of technology. Again, expansion wasn't always a nice, friendly pursuit. It often involved warfare. And the specific means by which the Mande people carried out warfare was on horseback. They, like the Mongols, who were their relative contemporaries, relied on mobile horsemen to attack their enemies and overrun them. In fact, one of the things that the Mandes would not trade for, which they were legally prohibited for trading, were horses. They could not give up their horses in exchange for goods because the empire was insistent on controlling that technology. This is a warfare technology that has enormous significance, and if they surrender horses in trade, then their enemies, their competitors, will gain the same technology to use against them. Just like modern empires like the United States tries to control computer technology that it knows can be used in the making of weapons systems, etc., nuclear technology. The Mali Empire was doing the same thing back in the 14th century. In this case, it was horses. Another part of it was metalworking. Weapons, the stirrups for horses, etc., all of this depended upon well-fashioned metal instruments, metal tools. That work was in the hands of blacksmiths, naturally, who would forge these tools. The blacksmiths were themselves kin groups, and indeed they can be described as castes because, again, like groups in India, they were both a family, an extended family, connected by marriage, connected by birth, and they shared common economic function, and that was metalworking. And their work was extremely important, again, in the development of the empire, especially in terms of warfare, to give the armies the necessary weapons to confront their enemies, along with their advantage of controlling horses, of course. Blacksmiths also engaged in religious activities. They developed lodges, or what we might call in the modern world brotherhoods. There were ceremonies of initiation. There were continuing religious ceremonies. They were believed to have special spiritual powers, that their craft was not simply a product of human knowledge and experience, but it was a divine gift that they had been given. And of course, this required sacrifices to gods, intercommunication with these beings in order to maintain this relationship, in order to maintain the technological advantages that they had. These were all highly secret brotherhoods. You had to be indoctrinated. You had to pass certain tests. You had to participate in the religious rites of the individual lodges. And all of this was kept extremely secret, for practical reasons, of course. If their knowledge of metallurgy, of how to shape and use metals, would spread, it would be the same as trading their horses, that they would be giving away an enormous technological advantage. So we see wrapped up in the blacksmiths of the Mali Empire both the social organizations that we've talked about in terms of lineage groups, castes in this case, the influence of religion throughout society, and of course the practical aspects of a trading empire of controlling technologies. The blacksmiths also served to spread Mande culture, the language, its religious rites. All of this became part of their project within the empire because as the empire expanded, the lodges moved out towards the frontiers of the empire, spreading not only a common language, but common cultural practices. So we have a complex interweaving here of social group, cultural values, and technologies, all a part of this 14th century trading empire. Now, something else that I've briefly mentioned and is going to come more and more significant as we go through the next couple of sessions is the issue of climate, of the ecological aspects of human existence. And this was true for the Mali Empire. The expansion of the empire came in the midst of a period of dry climate conditions in northern Africa. You might say, well, hasn't northern Africa always been a desert? Well, there's always been some desert. Its growth is of much more recent development. But the fact is, Africa has always experienced phases of relatively dry climate, then developments of wet climate. And in this case, some of the changes that Africa was experiencing in these centuries, from 1100 to 1500, were connected to broader climate changes around the globe. So just as we worry about global warming today, well, people back in earlier centuries were also affected by strong changes in global climatological conditions. In this case, the period in which the empire expanded was a period of dry weather. And this was extremely important because it made it possible for the Mali Empire to expand rapidly through its use of horses, its cavalry forces that it could use in attacking its enemies. And specifically because they were not exposed in any significant way to tsetse flies. Tsetse flies flourish in humid climates, just like mosquitoes. And they carry the same basic disease that we've all come to fear in Houston, encephalitis, sleeping sickness as it's commonly termed. The dry weather meant few ponds of water, marshes, where the flies could lay their eggs and where new generations of this insect could develop. So the population of flies declined, and that meant that horses would not be seriously affected by encephalitis. So this gave them, the Mali people, a real advantage in terms of their military expansion. But as the climate turned to a more humid, wetter climate by 1500, that military advantage was lost because tsetse flies began to grow rapidly in numbers. The spread of encephalitis devastated the horse population of the Mali Empire, and suddenly the empire finds itself in retreat. So this ecological change has an important effect on the ability of the empire to expand militarily. But there's more to the history of what happens to Mali than just, okay, the climate got wetter, the flies grew in number, encephalitis spread, and the military advantage diminished. That's certainly part of the picture. But there's a larger, more complex set of issues involved in what happened to Mali, because it wasn't just the Mali Empire. The Mali Empire would be followed by the Empire of Songhai and other empires in northern Africa. Many of the great empires throughout Africa were trading empires, whether it was Mali, Songhai in the northwest, the Kingdom of the Congo in southern Africa. There are a whole series of impressive imperial systems that are created in Africa in these centuries, leading up to about 1500 of the contemporary era. But none of them managed to survive for more than a couple of centuries. When you look at, let's say, the Roman Empire, the various imperial systems of China, there you see imperial systems that survived 500, 600, 700 years, and in China, one was succeeded by another with relatively short interregnums, periods in between the imperial periods of rule. But in Africa, these empires never succeeded in achieving long-term stability. So the problems of the Mali Empire are not limited just to climate change, which affected their ability to expand militarily. One of the problems that we've already seen with Asian trading empires as well is the uncertainties of long-distance trade. If long-distance trade was extremely profitable, it was in part because it was so dangerous. It was such a high-risk proposition. There were constant dangers, whether it was in the desert or on the ocean, of attack from bandits, problems with shifting commodity prices and value of commodities. And particularly for these trading empires in the pre-modern world, the problem of maintaining fragile alliances among a series of groups. The rulers of these trading empires, whether it's Funan, Mali, etc., had to maintain cooperative relationships between themselves and their political administrators, merchants, artisans like the blacksmiths, and in the case of the Mali Empire, they also had to deal with nomadic populations. In order to conduct that trade, to maintain trade routes that stretched all the way from northwest Africa towards the Red Sea, the Mali Empire had no way of extending its own military force those incredible distances. Indeed, even just across from its own border, once trade entered the desert, the Sahara Desert, the stability of those trade routes depended upon nomads, nomadic populations that relied partly on herding but also on raiding for their income. So what you had to do as the emperor of the Mali Empire was to negotiate agreements with these nomads to serve as protectors of your caravans. So you've got a complex set of groups and alliances that you have to maintain. The nomads, the merchants, the artisans, and almost inevitably, frictions and challenges are going to arise, making it virtually impossible over a very long period. We're not talking about 50 or 60 years, because over a short term, yes, there are talented leaders who can manage to put these kinds of relationships together and maintain them, but over centuries, the fact that these empires really could not completely control their own economic fate meant that they could not ensure long-term stability for their own imperial systems. Unlike, let us say, the Emperor of China, who exercised enormous authority through the nobility and landlords over the peasant population that produced most of the wealth of the empire. Here, these emperors of trading empires in the pre-modern world depend upon often fragile alliances with a complex series of groups. And usually they prove difficult, if not impossible, to maintain over very long periods of time. That, added to the vagaries, the uncertainties of long-distance trade, meant that most of these pre-modern trading empires could not last more than a couple of centuries. Those factors, in the case of Mali, combined with a changing ecology that undermined their advantage in terms of warfare on horseback, combined to bring that empire to an end. But in the meantime, a third trading empire of a different sort, one that in some ways looked more like a conventional land-based empire, was arising across Eurasia. And I just want to go back to the map for a minute because, again, when you look at this map and realize that if you start here on the Pacific coast of China and start traveling across this vast land that is China, northern India, well, most of India actually, into portions of the Middle East, southern Asia, and on into what became the Russian Empire, and even to the reaches of Eastern Europe. This vast area, at one time, for a brief period, was a single imperial system that the Mongols managed in a historical heartbeat to conquer these vast territories. Is one of the most striking developments of the pre-modern world, and really, as we will see in a variety of ways, sets the stage for the rise of modern imperial systems and for various aspects of what we consider to be modern societies. Now, the Mongols were nomadic peoples who depended upon the herding of animals and their abilities on horseback to hunt other animals. So they engaged in both herding and in hunting. These nomadic peoples of northern Asia were the founders of this great empire. Now, their relationships with the more sedentary groups to their south, people who populated what we come to know as China, these relationships were, as I suggested in an earlier lecture, a mix between fairly peaceful interaction in trade and occasional warfare. The nomads would trade the goats that they herded and tea that they gathered for grain and textiles produced by the sedentary populations. Again, here too we have, in a sense, exchanges, as we did with the Mali Empire, between different ecological zones. We have the grasslands that the nomads populate, and then the fertile valleys that the sedentary people populate. But we also have two radically different kinds of cultures. We have a nomadic population, and we have a sedentary agricultural population. So there were logical exchanges between the two groups that could be mutually beneficial. But at times, periodically, warfare would also break out, particularly with nomads attacking sedentary populations. And why that might happen, well, let us say food shortages occur, there is some type of disastrous impact upon the nomad's lifestyle. They might attack for those reasons. They might attack simply because there were inviting targets, extremely wealthy urban centers that offered them great riches in very quick order if they invaded those areas. There were a variety of reasons, but there was no consistent pattern of warfare. It could easily switch at any given time from attacks into trade. And the development of the Chinese Empire, in part, recognized the warfare threat with the development of the Great Wall and the development of its military forces. But even then, as the empire in China develops, still trade relationships with nomadic peoples continue because they're profitable, because they make sense for both sides. The advantage that the Mongols enjoyed was the same advantage that the Mande people of the Mali Empire enjoyed, and that was their abilities as horsemen. The sturdy horses, the muscular, short horses that the Mongols rode, could be powerful instruments of war. Even today, you can see games and ceremonies that Mongols carry out on horseback, and their feats as horsemen are absolutely spectacular. And the ability to fight from horseback was an exceptional ability. That's why other societies, civilizations, China, Rome, etc., had depended upon chariots. It's much easier to ride in a chariot and have a sword in your hand or a spear, etc., than it is to be riding on a horse. So the ability to fight from horseback was an exceptional one, and it also meant that they could move with extraordinary speed. By 1200 of the contemporary era, the Mongol tribes had merged into a single confederation, somewhat loosely structured, but essentially, again, a series of kin groups, lineage groups, that had formed a single confederation. So we see social organization and how that provides the underpinning, just as it did in China in a different way, for a political organization, in this case, a Mongol confederation. Here, again, as we saw with Mali, weather is going to make a difference, climatological change. The cooler climate that was apparent by 1200, that provided drier weather, that allowed the Mande people to expand and create their empire, had a detrimental effect on the pasturage of the Mongol people, meaning the grasslands on which their animals fed, their goats, their horses, and other animals. I mean, this was not cultivated land. This was land that was simply open grassland and depended upon rainfall. There were no irrigation systems. They were nomads. They simply moved their animals as they needed to so that they could pasture in new growing areas and provide sufficient food for themselves. But when the overall climate grew much drier, the grasslands dried up, and with that, the vegetation that fed their animals. Now, it's not an absolute disaster. It doesn't mean, oh, God, there's no food at all for the animals. It means the pressure is on the Mongols to find new acreage where they can still find sufficient food for their animals. If this were a sedentary population, as in China, it might have meant, well, we need to dig more irrigation ditches because there's still water in the rivers, so we need to provide more of that water flow onto our lands to keep our crops growing as the climate gets drier. But if you're nomadic people, you don't go around digging ditches. That's, not what your whole culture is based on. Instead, you expand. You look for new lands. And that's exactly what the Mongols would do. So the great sweep of the Mongol Empire began because of a change in climate. There were a lot of other factors that would drive them on, such as gaining great wealth by their conquest of sedentary agricultural civilizations. But still, the trigger that helps put them on the move for more than just occasional warfare, because that had been happening for centuries, that there had been periodic invasions or attacks on the agricultural civilizations that were emerging as China. That had been going on for centuries. But the idea that this would become essentially long-term, extended invasion over vast terrain was driven by the fact that the climate had gotten drier, so they had to have new lands on which to feed their animals. The other issue was control of trade. That, yes, there were periodic exchanges of goods between sedentary and nomadic peoples, but they were highly unreliable. There were no long-established permanent exchanges of goods. So another advantage, besides solving the pasturage problem that territorial expansion would bring, would be to create permanent trading relationships between this nomadic population and sedentary populations if the nomadic population now controlled the sedentary population instead of them being two distinct entities which occasionally exchanged goods. The great leader of this sweep that begins with climate change in 1200 was Genghis Khan. Now again, the images of Genghis Khan and the Mongols are these, savage people riding on horseback, slaughtering innocent civilians, creating havoc. And there's no question that they did do some of that. But they were far more than just bandits on horseback. These people were creating a vast empire. And just like in Southeast Asia, this was an empire that wanted standardization, a written language, a legal code that would help tie its territorial conquests together. Now, eventually, with the passing of Genghis Khan, once much of the empire has already been conquered, where most of the territory has already been enveloped, the empire was divided among 4 sons. And again, this would follow the logic of an extended kin group, a lineage group. How do you divide it up? Well, you divide it up among the obvious heirs within the family. And why division? Well, there's a lot of reasons for this, rivalries, etc. But the practical issue was, how could you possibly maintain single governance? One of the 4 was to be the dominant figure, the dominant Khan, if you will, the dominant ruler. But the fact is, the empire was essentially sliced into 4 huge geographical areas, and in large measure because really no one ruler could possibly have maintained control effectively over this vast territory. The death of Genghis Khan's grandson, the man who had become the ruler of China, came in 1294, when the Mongol Empire, again, stretched all the way from the Danube River in Central Europe to Beijing, to China, the eastern reaches of China. This vast territory had been absorbed. And again, it isn't just the enormity of the landmass that's encompassed, it's the complexity of the population groupings that are included within it. You have people who are Muslims, people who are Buddhists, you've got Chinese, you've got people who are of Turkish extraction. You have vast differences in ethnicity, language, religion. And it is the Mongols who are trying to maintain control over this vast area with a common language and their own standardized legal code. Now, again, it was going to be next to impossible to maintain this as a single empire. But something that happened even after the division, that existed even after the division of the empire into 4 segments, was that there was an extended period of peace and stability over Eurasia, over the land stretching from Europe to China. What I call the Pax Mongolica. Usually talked about the Pax Romana. Well, this is a much bigger peace process created by the Mongols. And this is what's going to trigger a tremendous surge in long-distance trade across this entire region, is when the Mongols establish peace and where they create security for trade. Because remember, the biggest inhibition to land-based trade was banditry. And in addition to that, of course, inferior roads that inhibited transportation. Well, those conditions were addressed by the Mongols as they created their empire. They improved roads, they improved security. The Mongol experience in China illustrates what they did and how they went about it. When the Mongols conquered China, which they had effectively done by the 1270s, it has been said that one Mongol invader was confronted by a member of the Chinese elite who said to the Mongol, you know, you can conquer an empire from horseback, but you can't rule it from there. And what he was pointing out was that, look, this is a sedentary population. We have a complex bureaucracy. You know, we have our scholarly gentry. We have this vast peasant population which we have to tax. You have these rivers that have to be maintained. These irrigation channels have to be maintained. You can't just go sweeping off on horseback and threatening people and get that whole system to work. And that was true. But what the Mongols did was adapt. As much as they created a large, centralized political system through military conquest, they also recognized the limits of what they could do in terms of their own culture and dynastic system. So they adapted in China to the scholarly gentry. In other words, most of the positions in the scholarly gentry, in other words, the bureaucracy, would still be controlled by the ethnic Chinese, with the Mongols retaining the top positions of command within the empire. So the system would be run for the benefit of the Mongols, but it would retain most of the principal characteristics of the Chinese bureaucracy and of the Chinese empires that had preceded it. This is how the Mongols were able to extend their control over such vast areas and establish peace. It wasn't by totally revamping the societies that they conquered, but rather by adapting to them and incorporating the ways that they governed their particular territories into this larger imperial order so that they could create long-term stability in these regions. However, even in China, where this fairly effective adaptation occurred, the Yuan, which was the Mongol dynasty, that's what it was called, the Yuan, will collapse by 1368. I'll come back in a moment to one of the key reasons why that occurred. Meanwhile, this system of rapid territorial conquest and then adaptation to local governing systems, the creation of a fairly coherent empire which incorporated distinct ethnicities, languages, and political systems in it, led to this long period of peace over centuries. It led to the restoration of the trade routes, known as the Silk Roads. It led to the incorporation of nomadic groups who had often warred on the merchants who attempted to use these long-distance trade systems. The nomadic tribes were often put to the service of the empire in protecting the trade routes, in a system somewhat similar to what the Mali Empire had done, but here the Mongols had much more control over the nomads. This was not a negotiated settlement. This was a matter of, well, look, if you want to survive as a nomadic group here within our empire, fine, but you're going to have to serve the empire by protecting the trade routes rather than warring upon them. So these nomadic groups are incorporated into a centralized imperial system. This helped provide for protection of the trade routes and for a vast expansion of trade. What the Mongols succeed in doing is that they are a warrior state which has launched itself on this vast expansion thanks to climatological change. But over time, it incorporates both its own military prowess and its control of vast territories with the promotion of long-distance trade. The Mongols stand probably as the first early modern trading empire, an empire that had vast territorial reach and controlled enormous populations, and yet also benefited to a significant degree from long-distance trade. It provided an example of what was to come. It provided essentially the prototypical system by which large land-based empires would also incorporate, to a far greater extent than ever before, trade to allow them to create rapidly expanding empires with rapidly expanding economies. The Mongols provide the prototype. The Ottomans and others would do it more effectively and more extensively in the centuries ahead. So what we see with the development of trade in the early parts of the contemporary era, if we go back 2,000 years and follow it up to 1300 with the rise of the Mongols, is how trade expands the reach of these empires, generates new wealth, creates new contacts between cultures and civilizations and their economies. We also see again that trade isn't just about commodities. It's about the exchange of ideas and the exchange of disease. That last point hasn't been terribly apparent in what I've talked about up till now, because these were the early trading empires of the contemporary era. It's only when we get to the era of the Mongols that we see a vast trading empire creating secure trade routes encompassing millions upon millions of people. What that means is not only will it facilitate the movement of goods, but it will facilitate the movement of disease. A viral epidemic emerging in northern Asia will not be restricted in its spread simply to the grasslands of that region. The trade routes will now help the carriers of that disease, fleas and rats, to spread that epidemic over vast territories. One of the reasons that the Mongol Empire, the empire of the Yuan dynasty, collapsed in China in 1294 was the impact of the Black Death. And, of course, we're going to see a great deal more of that as we look at death and disease. Meanwhile, all of these early trading empires, and even the Mongols ultimately, even though they're the prototype for the later, sturdier type of empire, nevertheless, all of them exhibited a certain fragility. For most of them, it was the matter of trying, one, to maintain alliances among a vast number of groups, merchants, nomads, artisans, and partly it was due to the vagaries of international trade, where commodities could fluctuate wildly in terms of price and therefore have enormous negative impacts upon the economies of these imperial systems. The Mongols, although they too would be relatively fleeting in their control over a few centuries, nevertheless established the basis for large land-based empires that could also exploit a rapid growth in international long-distance trade. They became the prototype, as I said, for the empires that would follow in the early modern world, such as the Ottomans, the Spanish, the Portuguese. we'll see the development of those trading empires down the road. But first, what we're going to address in the next session is the ecological factor of epidemic disease that both radically impacted pre-modern civilizations and had a vitally important role to play in the coming of modernity itself. That's a topic that we'll address in session 4. Thanks. Mm-hmm.